Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares, where we explore the unsettling and unexpected. Tonight's stories come from married couples, but not the romantic kind you might expect. These are the creepiest things people have ever experienced from their spouses, from eerie midnight behaviors to chilling confessions. These tales will leave you wondering, how well do we really know the person we sleep next to every night? Before we dive in, I want to share something important. I'm raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and any support would mean the world to me. If you'd like to help, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for being here, and now, let's get into these spine-chilling marital moments. Story 1. This isn't about my spouse, it's about me, ... I had a friend my wife absolutely hated. To be fair, I eventually grew to hate him too. After months of her nagging me to cut ties with him, I decided to play a little prank. One day I called her up, pretending to sob, and said, "Babe, Rudy died." I gave him some money to get some ganja, but the deal went wrong. Now the cops want to talk to me. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. She bought it completely. For the next 3 or 4 months, I kept up the lie. Occasionally, while we were riding in the car, I'd do the classic 1,000-yard stare. "What's wrong, babe?" she'd ask. "I just can't believe Rudy is dead," I'd reply. She'd rub my shoulders and say, "It's okay. It wasn't your fault." Eventually, I thought it was time to bring Rudy in on the joke. So one day, we randomly bumped into him while we were out. As soon as she saw him, her face went pale, like she'd just seen a ghost. "What's wrong, babe?" I asked innocently. Rudy walked up to her and started chatting. She turned to me, absolutely furious. "You jerk. You told me he was dead." I played dumb. "What are you talking about?" Rudy joined in, grinning. He can't hear or see me. My wife, now in full panic mode, shouted, "Toka, can't you see him? He's standing right in front of us." Feigning concern, I said, "You okay, babe? We'd better get you home. You're seeing things." I finally couldn't keep it up anymore and let her in on the joke. To this day, it's one of my proudest moments. Story 2. My husband and I had been married for about 5 years when one night, while tidying up the garage, I found a shoebox under his workbench. At first, it seemed like no big deal, but the box was for women's high heels, a brand I didn't own. Curious, I decided to take a closer look. Had he bought them for me as part of some sexy surprise? Was he secretly into cross-dressing? Or worse, did he have someone on the side? My curiosity got the better of me, so I opened the box. Knowing what I know now, I wish I hadn't. Inside was a collection of women's fingernails. Not acrylic, not Preston's real fingernails. They had clearly been removed whole, most with bits of flesh and blood still clinging to the back. The smell was horrendous, and I nearly gagged. The only reason I hadn't noticed it sooner was because the box had been meticulously sealed with layers of saran wrap, keeping the stench contained. My stomach churned. Where had these come from? None of it made any sense. Then it hit me about a year ago. There had been a news story about severed hands washing up on a nearby beach. Each hand was missing its pinky nail. The cops were baffled, and the story had disappeared from the news cycle without any resolution. Now I was holding what appeared to be the missing pieces, in my garage, under my husband's workbench. Terrified, I decided it was best not to ask questions. I carefully sealed the box, put it back exactly as I'd found it, and went back into the house. Afterward, I made dinner for the family and tried to act like nothing was wrong. We had turkey breast and potatoes, a recipe I'd seen on the Food Network. Cooking calmed my nerves, though I don't get to watch that channel as much as I'd like. Story 3. Not my spouse, but me. One year, around Halloween, my sister-in-law and I came up with this prank to pull on my husband. I bought a bunch of fake blood and decided I'd stage a fake murder scene by lying in the bathtub, covered in it. I set everything up, got into the tub, and waited for him to come in. I must have been lying there for 20 minutes before he finally walked in. But as soon as he did, I couldn't keep it together and started hysterically laughing. So much for the prank. His only response: "You better get out of there before that shit gets in your vagina." Definitely not something I had thought about beforehand. In hindsight, it was a terrible prank to try to pull pretty mean, actually. Another time, for April Fool's Day, I painted his bar of soap with clear nail polish so it wouldn't lather up. I also sewed all of his underwear together. He never said anything about either prank, which made it even funnier to me. Story 4. My husband has a knack for being a bit of a creeper, but one time he took it to a whole new level. I had just gotten home from work and was changing clothes in the bedroom. I usually close the door when I change, so when I heard the front door shut and his footsteps heading down the stairs, I figured I was alone in the apartment. As I was changing, I heard a shuffling noise in the hallway. At first, I thought it was the cat until I glanced at the bed and realized the cat was lying right there, fast asleep. Starting to feel uneasy, I called out my husband's name. No response. I heard more noises and became convinced someone was in the apartment. I flung open the bedroom door, ready to confront whatever or whoever was there, only to find my husband standing silently by the door, listening to me. He scared the absolute crap out of me. I immediately started yelling at him, but he just did this creepy laugh, completely unbothered. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he pretended to leave the apartment 2 more times, each time trying to freak me out all over again. To this day, I have no idea what he was up to, but it was definitely more than a little disturbing. Story 5. Years ago, my wife sat bolt upright in bed in the middle of the night, startling me awake. I sat up and asked, "Hun, what's up? Did you have a bad dream?" She turned her head toward me, her eyes distant, almost like she was staring through me. In a slow, measured tone, she said, "Someday, I will end you." Then she calmly laid back down, closed her eyes, and went right back to sleep. I decided to sleep downstairs that night. It freaked me out completely. The next morning, she had no memory of it. When I told her what she said, she felt terrible for saying something so creepy even if she didn't mean it. Story 6. My wife suffers from very vivid dreams and nightmares. One night, she was fast asleep while I was sitting in bed next to her, reading the latest Stephen King collection. She was snoring gently, completely at peace, while I was lost in my book. Out of nowhere, she went from lying on her side to sitting bolt upright in bed like a spring-loaded horror movie jump scare. She let out this sounder mix between a hungry lion's roar and a diesel engine revving. I froze, my book forgotten, staring at her in complete terror as she sat there panting for a few seconds. Then she turned to me, her expression completely calm, and asked, "What?" It took me a moment to respond, mostly because my balls had retreated into my chest, and my butthole was puckered tighter than the period at the end of this sentence. Story 7. Not my wife, but me who's the creepy one. I turned 40 last year, and my wife decided it was time to get serious about writing a will. We met with an attorney to start the process, but because of my work schedule, I had to handle my sessions separately from hers. Aside from the usual financial and beneficiary arrangements, we got to the what to do with my remains section. That's when I decided to have a little fun. My will now explicitly states that all my salvageable organs are to be donated immediately, and the rest of my remains should be donated to medical or scientific research set for my skull. I've requested that my skull be saved, cleaned, preserved, and mounted in a glass case. My skull is to be displayed in our home and brought out for my birthday, Thanksgiving, and Christmas, where it must be included in all family events and dinners on those days. Needless to say, my wife was completely taken aback. Her initial response was, "Seriously?" With a straight face, I replied, "If you love me, you'll honor my wishes." She didn't say anything for a good 5 minutes. I half expected to make another trip to the attorney to change it back, but after a series of clarifying questions, she reluctantly agreed. What started as a creepy joke is now officially in my will. I still wonder if she actually go through with it, or if she just agreed to shut me up. Knowing her, it's probably the latter. Story 8. A few years ago, my wife woke me up in the middle of the night, saying there was someone in the room. Naturally, I checked, but of course, there was no one there. She was absolutely terrified, screaming, trying to hide, and pointing to a specific spot, about 2 feet away from the bed. At first, I thought she was dreaming or confused, but as it went on, it started to really creep me out. Her fear was so genuine, and the way she kept insisting someone was there made my skin crawl. I tried my best to reassure her, but nothing worked. After about an hour of this, she finally fell back asleep. I was rattled, but eventually managed to drift off. The next morning, my wife got a text message that gave us both chills. It was from her family, letting her know that her grandmother had passed away during the night at almost the exact time as her episode. To this day, it still freaks me out, and my wife refuses to talk about it at all. Story 9. I'm not sure if what I do qualifies as sleep talking, because I remember it and am fully aware of what I'm saying. The thing is, I just can't stop the words from coming out of my mouth. It's like I'm stuck floating somewhere between being awake and being in dreamland. Often what I say makes total sense to me because, in my head, I'm not lying in bed. I'm battling zombies with Bruce Campbell or chasing unicorns through a mystical forest. My boyfriend probably says, "Stop being so weird before I fall asleep," at least twice a week. I'd probably come off as less creepy if he didn't humor me so much. For instance, when I once blurted out, "Where have all the unicorns gone?" his deadpan response was, "Have you looked in the forbidden forest?" Honestly, he's just as weird as I am. Story 10. My wife has a habit of mumbling or talking in her sleep. Most of the time, it's just incoherent, gibberish, sometimes even cute. But one night, about a year ago, things took a much darker turn. I half woke up in the middle of the night and saw my wife lying on her side, facing away from me. Naturally, I took this as the perfect opportunity to spoon. I scooted over and wrapped my arm around her, but she instinctively shrugged me off. Thinking nothing of it, I waited for a moment and tried again, adjusting my position slightly. This time, she didn't just shrug me off. No, as soon as I made contact, she violently threw my arm off, sat up, turned to me with wide, unblinking eyes, and in a voice that sounded straight out of a horror movie, growled, "Don't you fucking touch me." Then, as if nothing had happened, she immediately rolled back onto her side and lay there motionless. I was so freaked out I practically vaulted to the opposite edge of the bed and stayed there for the rest of the night. Too scared to move. The best part, the next morning, I woke up in a near panic to her trying to spoon me. When she asked why I was being so squirmy, I told her what happened. She burst out laughing, saying she didn't remember any of it. To this day, I always give her a little poke to test the waters, before trying to cuddle at night. Story 11. One time, my husband and I had our in-laws watch our 1-year-old son so we could have some time to ourselves. My husband told me he had a surprise planned, so we got in the car and started driving. He didn't tell me where we were going, just that it was a secret. We drove to the outskirts of town and eventually into the countryside. At some point, half joking, I asked him, "You're not taking me into the boonies to murder me, are you?" He turned, gave me a smile, a real enough smile, but didn't say anything right away. That tiny pause, combined with his lack of immediate reassurance, was just unsettling enough to freak me out a little. I laughed it off, but I couldn't help being a bit wary for the rest of the drive. Of course, he wasn't planning anything sinister. He ended up taking me out to a secluded spot to see the stars. It was beautiful, and we had a wonderful time. Still, to this day, I can't help but remember that moment whenever I think about that trip. Oh, and right now, he's sitting beside me, reading H.P. Lovecraft. Story 12. Here's a dysfunctional home story for you. I was around 8 months old, living with my mother and father in a small house out in the middle of nowhere. My dad had a few issues, and back in his heyday, he was involved in his share of shady and downright awful activities. My mum, however, thought that was all far in the past. She was happily enjoying her role as a wife and mother. One day, those old habits resurfaced in the worst way. I was playing in the living room, and my mum was cooking dinner when my dad walked in from the deck. He stood next to her in silence for a moment, then casually sighed, "I'm seriously considering hiring someone to kill you," and walked out of the house. Not even a joke. Apparently, he thought killing my mom was the only way to get out of the relationship, or something equally twisted. My mum, being the absolute angel she is, spent the next 3 hours packing up my life, leaving all her own belongings behind, and got us on a plane to the other side of the country, where family lived. Not long after, my mum heard through the grapevine that my dad had already approached an old friend, trying to recruit them into his plan. Yish. I haven't seen the man since. Every few years, he'll try to start a conversation, only to disappear again. The last thing I heard about him, he killed my half-sister's fish with crystal meth. Needless to say, I thank my lucky stars for my mum every single day. Story 13. Shortly after we got married, the ring came out, and it scared the absolute shit out of me. My husband and I watched it at home one evening, but since he was working the graveyard shift at the time, he had to leave for work right after the movie. We only had one car, so I drove him to work. The whole drive, I kept begging him to call in sick, so I wouldn't have to sleep alone that night. He thought it was hilarious how freaked out I was. "Just go home, put on a comedy, snuggle up with the cats, and you'll be fine," he said, laughing. So I drove home by myself. As soon as I walked through the door, the phone rang. If you've seen The Ring, you can imagine how unnerving that was. I jumped about 10 feet in the air. Who the hell calls at 1 a.m. on a Wednesday? I hesitated, praying I wouldn't hear the words 7 days. When I picked up, it was my husband. "Sorry to bother you, babe," he said, "but I think I missed an important call, and they didn't leave a message. Could you check the machine for me?" He'd been waiting on a call from his admissions advisors in Florida, who loved to call at the weirdest hours. Sure enough, I looked at the answering machine, and the blinking light told me there was a new message. I told him, and he asked me to go ahead and play it. I hit play, and instantly, the most blood-curdling, nightmare-inducing noises erupted from the machine. It sounded like something straight out of hell. I screamed like the devil himself had appeared, slammed the off button so hard the machine flew off the counter, and collapsed onto the floor in a sobbing heap. Somehow, I was still holding my cell phone. I lifted it to my ear, still gasping, and heard my husband laughing on the other end. "Are you crying?" he asked, amused. "No," I grumbled in my poutiest, most obviously crying voice. Turns out, when he got to work, he'd pulled up the Ring's official website, which had a bunch of spooky noises playing. He thought it would be hilarious to leave me a voicemail with the sound. I don't even remember what happened next. I think I just called him a jerk and went to bed, or rather, laid in bed with my eyes wide open and a knife under my pillow until the sun came up. Story 14. Last year, I was in Denver for a conference and decided to take full advantage of the city's new recreational legislation. It was a big conference, and I couldn't find a hotel room until the last minute. That's how I ended up at the Patterson Mansion bed and breakfast, just south of the Capitol building. I was staying in the Prague room, the highest room in the building, both in elevation and, well, for me personally that week. It was Thursday morning, Around 9 a.m., I was relaxing before a scheduled lunch with some vendors. SportsCenter was playing in the background, and I was gazing at the early morning sun hitting the Capitol building from my massive window. I was, admittedly, quite lit, typically not my vibe back home, but hey, when in Rome. Suddenly, I heard a loudspeaker from the street below. Naturally, I freaked out and assumed I'd been busted for smoking in my room. I slowly crawled to the window, peered over the sill, and looked down at the street. To my relief, it wasn't the cops. It was a group of 3rd or 4th graders on a field trip, led by a teacher with a loudspeaker. She was giving a lecture about the history of the Patterson Mansion and, wouldn't you know it, focusing on the supposed haunted nature of my exact room. I listened as she described the paranormal legends of the prog room. Once she transitioned into talking about the building's history in the 1880s, I got an idea. The window in my room starts just a foot off the floor and stretches up 6 or 7 feet, making it the perfect stage. I slowly stepped into the window frame, creating a silhouette. No one was looking up at the room yet, as the teacher had their attention focused elsewhere. I locked eyes with one unsuspecting child and stared at him. As soon as our eyes met, I slowly backed out of the frame without breaking eye contact. The reaction was immediate. The kid screamed and started crying, sending the rest of the group into complete chaos. Teachers scrambled to corral a mob of terrified children running down the street. I crawled back to the window to witness the aftermath. There they were, a panicked crowd of kids fleeing while their teachers tried desperately to regain control. My work here was done. Story 15. My husband doesn't usually have night terrors, but when he does, I always seem to witness them. 2 particular experiences still give me chills. The first time, I dreamt that a slender, man-like figure walked into our bedroom and stood over my husband, as if to harm him. I woke up at that exact moment, sitting bolt upright in bed. The next morning, I'd almost forgotten about it until my husband casually said, "I had the weirdest dream last night. Some slender, man-type guy came into our bedroom and tried to kill me. Every hair on my body stood on end." The second time was even stranger. In the middle of the night, my husband suddenly sat up in bed, frantic and panicked, caught in what seemed like a mix of a lucid dream and a full-blown night terror. He kept saying that a black, smoky, humanoid figure was in the room, trying to hurt him. It took a long time to console him and wake him up fully. He was deep in the dream and wouldn't snap out of it. When he finally calmed down, he said it was like the black smoke demon from Game of Thrones' Melisandre's shadow baby. That imagery alone was enough to creep me out. I eventually got him to lie back down and fall asleep again. But here's the part that still haunts me. As I turned over to go back to sleep, I reached for my blanket and a book that had fallen onto the floor. Just as I extended my hand, I saw something, a black, smoky wisp, move across the floor, mere inches from my hand. Every nerve in my body went on high alert, and any lingering annoyance or sleepiness I had vanished instantly. To this day, I'm not sure what happened, but both experiences left me unnerved and questioning what's lurking in the shadows. Story 16. This happened with my boyfriend, not a husband. I've never been married. One night, we stayed up until around 4 a.m., having the worst fight we'd ever had. After finally making up, he fell asleep while I left the room to go to the bathroom. When I came back, I found him passed out on the floor, wrapped in a blanket, with his pillow beside him. I leaned down to wake him up, and his eyes fluttered open. He immediately sat up and shouted, "Ah, why am I on the floor?" "Good question," I replied. "Let's get you back in bed." "Okay," he mumbled, then promptly fell back asleep. Still on the floor, I tried again to wake him, but he was completely unresponsive. So, naturally, I did what any rational person would do. I waved a slice of pizza under his nose. It worked, kind of. He started eating it. Then his eyes popped open, and he said, "What the hell?" Then he fell asleep again. At this point, I gave up and kissed him on the cheek. His eyes popped open again, and he blurted out, "Oh my God, what the fuck? What did you do to me? Why am I hard? Why does my mouth taste like pizza? Why am I on the floor? Did you drug me? Did you rape me? No, don't come near me. What the fuck did you do to me?" I calmly explained what had happened, and he groggily climbed back into bed. I left to use the bathroom again, thinking the chaos was over. But when I came back, he was standing butt naked in the middle of the room, holding my car keys and staring at his feet with drool running down his chin. "Honey?" I asked hesitantly. "Mom, come on, we're gonna be late for my dentist appointment," he said. You don't have an appointment?" "Yes, I do. God, why are you so forgetful?" "No, sweetie, I rescheduled the appointment. You can go back to sleep." "Oh, okay. One more thing," I added. "How old are you?" "What the fuck, Mom? I'm 13. You're stupid. He's 18, by the way." "I'm not your mom," I said. "Who are you?" Trying not to laugh, I replied, "I'm your girlfriend from the future." "You're stupid," he muttered, then shuffled back to bed. Thinking the night's madness was over, I left the room again for a moment. When I came back, he was thrashing in bed, clearly having a nightmare. Concerned, I put a hand on his arm to wake him. "Newbury," he screamed, his eyes snapping open with a look of utter terror. He threw my hand off him before his eyes focused on me, realizing it was just me. Then he started crying. Apparently in his dream, all of his deceased relatives were chasing him, moaning, "Join us." At that point, I decided sleep was no longer on the menu. I kept him awake for the rest of the night. Story 17. Not married, but I was once engaged to a girl who secretly installed a GPS tracking app on my phone called Find My Friends. I didn't even know it was there until I stumbled across it one day. As soon as I saw it, I had this sickening suspicion that she'd put it there without telling me. I didn't want to confront her outright in case I was wrong, so I decided to play it cool and see if she'd admit it. Turned out, it was easier than I thought. I casually said, "I think I accidentally picked up some kind of malware. It's installing apps on its own. Probably some developer, just trying to inflate their download numbers or something." She looked confused and asked, "What are you talking about?" "There's this app on my phone that I didn't install, Find My Friends, or something." So weird, her face lit up. "Oh, I put that on your phone so I can always know where you are. If you don't answer your phone, I can see if you're somewhere where you can't have it out. I have it installed on my phone too, and so do a lot of my friends. It's fun." I was floored. That's when I lost it and went on a full rant about how violated I felt. She, of course, told me I was overreacting and claimed she had a right to know where I was at all times. Her defense: "It doesn't even work since it's not compatible between iOS and Android, so it's not like you should care. Side note, Android master race forever." But even though the app didn't actually function, the fact that she installed it without my knowledge felt like 200 shades of wrong. Looking back, I realized this was a massive red flag. Emotional abuse doesn't have to be physical to leave a mark. If something doesn't feel right, trust your gut, be strong, and for your own sake, GT. Story 18. Less than a year into our marriage, I found a random phone number written down. It stood out because he was new to the area and didn't know many people. When I asked about it, he said he didn't remember what it was. A quick Google search revealed it belonged to a local group for larger gay men. I didn't have any issue with my husband being bisexual. It wasn't the discovery itself that bothered me. What broke my trust was the lying. We'd met through kink and were always open about unconventional topics, so this level of secrecy felt unnecessary. Over the years, I uncovered more profiles on nearly every gay hookup site you can imagine, chat histories, and conversations about meeting up. He claimed he never actually hooked up with anyone, but when faced with such a web of lies, it became hard to know what to believe. What made it worse was that I'd always been open to the idea of ethical non-monogamy. But the key word there is ethical, and his dishonesty completely undermined that possibility. I wish him well, but I'm glad we're no longer married for this, and for many other reasons. Story 19. On a Tuesday night, Mai and I fell asleep early. Around 9 p.m, at exactly 12 a.m, I woke up because I had to pee. I remember glancing at the clock and noting the time before heading to the bathroom. When I returned to bed, Mai was still sound asleep, but started mumbling something unintelligible. At first, I ignored it, assuming she was just talking in her sleep. But then, as clear as day, she said, "Something bad is going to happen." That got my attention. Thinking it was just more sleep talk, I didn't say anything. But then she repeated it. "Something bad is going to happen. They're watching us." That sent a chill down my spine. Freaked out, I started pushing her gently, trying to wake her up. It took a few seconds, but she finally woke, completely unaware of what she had just said. When I told her, she shrugged it off as a weird dream. I tried to go back to sleep, though it wasn't easy. Fast forward 2 days to Thursday. I was on Facebook, chatting with a good friend of mine, just catching up, when he said, "Not good, man." Concerned, I asked what was wrong, and he told me this horrifying story. 2 nights ago, I was leaving a friend's house late at night, he said. As I was walking to my car, 3 guys jumped me. They dragged me into their car, held me at gunpoint, and drove me to an ATM. They forced me to empty my savings and give it to them. After that, they beat me, took my wallet and phone, and dumped me miles from my car. I was furious, obviously, but then I asked him, "When did this happen?" "Late Tuesday night," he replied, at exactly 12 o'clock. Story 20. This isn't about a spouse, but an ex-girlfriend. It was Christmas Eve, and since the small town we lived in only had a population of about 200, there wasn't much to do. We decided to watch The Passion of the Christ to pass the time. About 20 minutes into the movie, my girlfriend fell asleep with her head resting in my lap, while I absent-mindedly ran my fingers through her hair. The movie reached the scene where Pontius Pilate asks the crowd whether they want to free Jesus or Barabbas. Out of nowhere, my girlfriend started speaking in this raspy, evil-sounding voice. It wasn't just incoherent mumbling. It sounded like 2 complete sentences, spoken in a tone full of anger and hatred. Her face twisted into a scowl as she said it. I froze. I watch a lot of foreign films and have heard many languages, so my first thought was that her brain was hearing the Aramaic spoken in the movie and trying to interpret it into some made-up language. But whatever she said didn't sound random. It was like a mix of Greek, Yiddish, and Arabic, but the words were clear, almost perfectly formed. If I'd had a voice recorder at that moment, I'm convinced someone could have transliterated what she said. It was that distinct. My heart was racing for about 10 minutes before I could calm myself down. The next day, I asked her if she remembered having any nightmares or strange dreams. She said she didn't. When I told her what happened, she just laughed and said I was being silly. For context, she was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, ADHD, major depression, and some mild schizophrenia. Whether it was her mind processing something subconsciously or something else entirely, I'll never forget how unsettling that moment was. Story 21. I never thought I'd talk about this, but here we go. My wife and I had quite an odyssey living together during university, enduring terrible flats, stressful accommodations, and the constant weight of her having to lie to her father about her life. He didn't like me for a long time, which only added to the strain. The accumulated stress eventually led to her experiencing strange episodes of half-sleep and sleepwalking. She would fall into this half-asleep state in the evenings, her eyes still open, and she'd talk to me as if we were having a normal conversation. But in reality, she was dreaming, living in an entirely different reality. I'd only realized something was off when she started saying things that didn't make any sense. The two strangest occurrences were what I've come to think of as her talking from the future, and from silent parts of the brain. One time, she spoke to me as though it was 5 years into the future. In her dream state, she believed she was pregnant with our first child and studying medicine, none of which was true in reality. She spoke about it so casually, as if it were just our day-to-day life. I started probing gently, asking her what year it was. Her responses sent shivers down my spine. The calmness with which she described this alternate reality, while being completely disconnected from the present moment, was the strangest thing I've ever experienced. Even though we've since moved past those difficult times, those moments still linger in my memory. It was like catching a glimpse into a parallel life, a world we never lived but that felt oddly real to her in those moments. Story 22. A few months ago, I bought some Batman pajamas. The day I got them, I drove over to my boyfriend's place after work. He told me he was hopping in the shower and left the door unlocked for me to let myself in. When I arrived, I could hear the shower running, so I decided to surprise him in my new PJs. I changed quickly, then crept upstairs after hearing the water stop. Quiet as a ninja, I waited for just the right moment. As he stepped out of the bathroom, completely unsuspecting, I jumped out from around the corner and, in my worst Christian Bale voice, yelled, "I am Batman." He yelped and jumped backward, startled out of his skin. I collapsed on the floor laughing. He hadn't heard me come in at all. Safe to say, I nailed the element of surprise. Fun fact, before we started dating, I low-key stalked him. He was a regular customer at the coffee shop where I worked, and I noticed he came in at the same time every weekday. On the days I wasn't working, I'd sit there doing homework around the time he usually showed up, just to catch a glimpse of him. I rarely spoke to him, just a friendly hello here and there. But eventually, I worked up the nerve to ask him out. When I finally told him about my little stalking phase, he just laughed and thought it was cute. And now we've been together ever since. Story 23. Post-coitus. Cuddles. She runs her fingers along my skin and smiles. "Your skin is so soft," she murmurs. I stroke her hair, smiling back. She compliments me on my firm yet supple flesh. I nod, nuzzling her head. Then she says, with complete sincerity, "I just want to skin you and wear you like a flesh pajama." I stop stroking her hair, letting the silence drag on. Finally, she adds, metaphorically, of course. I smile, nod, and stroke her cheek before drifting off to sleep. A few days later, it's my turn to rest my head on her chest. I casually say, "You know, you'd make a wonderful nightshirt. Smooth and silky, so familiar." We laugh, and somehow, this spirals into an absurd promise. When one of us dies, the other will skin them and wear them, so we can always be close. We both crack up, laughing until our sides hurt. It's morbid, ridiculous, and makes no sense, but it's our little inside joke. "You'd look so wonderful hanging in my closet," she teases. "I'll save you a spot for when you die." "Careful," I reply. "If you keep being bitchy, I'll turn you into a pair of socks." The weirdest part, she doesn't even like scary movies. I do, but I'm pretty reserved. It's bizarre, completely nonsensical, and absolutely horrible when you think about it. But somehow, it's also ours, ... and I wouldn't trade it for anything. Story 24. I once dated a guy who sleepwalked, and let me tell you, it was an experience. Back when I was staying in his tiny single bed at uni, I woke up one night to him yanking on my arm and standing on the bed, screaming, "We have to get out, we have to go." Naturally, I assumed the fire alarm was going off, but when I listened, everything was silent. Still groggy, I just shook my head and told him to go back to sleep. Instead, he bolted for the door, ran down the hallway, and started yelling at everyone to get out. For a solid 6 to 7 minutes, he was in full crisis mode, convinced disaster was imminent. Then, as abruptly as it started, he calmly declared, "Well, we're all fucked. Good night," and climbed back into bed like nothing had happened. I was absolutely terrified, and the next morning, he had no memory of it whatsoever. On a much cuter note, my current boyfriend has a tendency to talk in his sleep, too. He doesn't like mushrooms on his pizza, which is a running joke between us, and one night, I woke up to pee and got back into bed. Half asleep, I gave him a little kiss and said, "I love you." Without missing a beat, he mumbled, "I love you too, even if you do like mushrooms on your pizza," and then rolled over. He has no recollection of saying it, but it melted my heart. Even in his sleep, he loves me. Story 25. A couple of times a year, my husband will get out of bed confused, start rambling about something completely crazy, and then get annoyed when I don't understand. By morning, he has no recollection of it whatsoever. After 10 years of marriage, I've learned to just find it amusing and play along to see how far he'll go. A few months ago, a strange noise woke me up in the middle of the night. I opened my eyes to find his face inches from mine, eyes closed, making slobbery, smacking noises with his mouth, no words, just these bizarre, wet sounds. Half asleep and thoroughly grossed out, I yelled at him to roll over, which he did. End of story, or so I thought. The next morning, I'd mostly forgotten about it until we started talking about dreams. I told him about mine, and he said he remembered having a weird one, too. In his dream, monsters were trying to attack me and our daughters, and he was bravely scaring them off. That's when I burst out laughing. The idea that those slobbery noises could scare anything away was just absurd. I told him what he'd actually been doing, and he decided to demonstrate what he thought he was doing to scare the monsters. Full-on Tasmanian devil sounds complete with tongue movements and growling. Apparently, while asleep, he'd only managed the mouth and tongue part, and none of the sound effects made it through. Neither version was remotely scary, and now I call him Taz to tease him about his heroic defense efforts. And that wraps up tonight's unsettling look into the creepy side of marriage. If these stories left you questioning what's lurking behind closed doors, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more haunting tales. Hit the like button, follow for updates, and be sure to check out my other videos for even more chilling content. Once again, if you can, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your kindness and generosity make a real difference. Thank you for watching, and remember, even those closest to us can hold the darkest secrets. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.